Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
1994, it's the summertime in Georgia. We had a terrible flood come through, and when it began, our county, Taylor County, was one of the hardest hit counties in the state. The Flint River runs through our county, and we knew it was going to be bad. And I received a call from Governor Zell Miller early on, and he told me that he wanted to get out and help us. He was available, anything we needed, and Governor Miller and I were great friends, had known one another quite some time. And as the days progressed, with the river rising, conditions got much worse for counties south of us. For a solid week there, it was just terrible. The rains were relentless, didn't let up. After everything subsided, about a week later, I get a call from Governor Miller's aide, Martha Gillen, and Martha tells me that the governor is on a tour of Georgia via helicopter, and he wants to come into Taylor County and meet me at the airport that afternoon and talk with me and just see what I needed and things like that. So we had National Guard deployed, GEMA, and all kind of people in the county working to restore order. And I tell a couple of my deputies to go to the store, get some cold drinks and things like that, have them at the airport. I didn't have any idea who was coming. About 2 o'clock, two military helicopters land, and on board are Governor Zell Miller, United States Senator Sam Nunn, United States Senator Paul Coverdale, Congressman Sanford Bishop, the Director of FEMA, James Lee Witt, the Director of GEMA, Gary McConnell, and a host of Atlanta news media and all kind of people. And they get off, and we're standing around. I'm passing out drinks, and all of a sudden, Governor Miller puts his arm around me and says, "Nick, I need to go over to your house and use a landline phone right now. What is your number?" I tell him my home number, and one of the aides writes that down, and they're scrambling these radio transmissions to somebody, I don't know who. And so we start walking towards my house. You have to understand, I live, my property butts right up to the airport there in Butler, Georgia. So we're walking across the lawn, my backyard, everybody, the whole group. And I look and I notice these cars parked at my house, and it dawns on me about that time. My wife is a school teacher at the time, and it's summertime. She and a lot of her girlfriends are having their weekly card game in our kitchen. So we open the back door and walk in, and there's everybody sitting at the table having lunch and playing cards. I bring all these people into my house, and my wife doesn't know half of who I've got, and we're making introductions. Well, what the deal was to use the phone, Governor Miller was about to accept a phone call from President Bill Clinton. And the purpose of that phone call was to declare Georgia a disaster area. So we're standing there in the kitchen, and everybody's shaking hands, and all of a sudden my phone rings. And Governor Miller looks over at me and says, "All right, Nick, answer the phone." So I assumed it was going to be the president. I answered it, with the, "Hello, this is Sheriff Nick Giles of Taylor County." And this voice on the other end says, "Hi, Nick, Bill Clinton. I understand you're having a rough time down in Georgia." And I responded, "Yes, sir, Mr. President, we sure are." And he says, "Well, let me speak to Zell just a minute. I'm going to try to rectify that and help you guys." And within seconds, Governor Miller held the phone off to the side and said, "Mr. President, I'd like to tell the group here with me what you're doing." And of course, we all clapped and everything was good. And a few minutes later, they exchanged a little conversation and hung up. Moments after hanging up, my son, Lee, who was probably 5 or 6 years old at the time, he comes walking down the hallway, and my wife says, "Lee, where have you been? You just missed it. Your daddy and Governor Miller just talked to the President of the United States." And my son, with a little smirky grin, says, I didn't miss anything. I was listening on the extension. And the next day on the Atlanta Journal, AJC had a headline, I think, something to the effect of President declares Georgia emergency, federal emergency. And in a little caption below it, it says, as Taylor Sheriff's son eavesdrops. The fact that Georgia was declared a federal disaster area from my kitchen was, I saved the telephone. You know, we do everything now is on cell phone, but I saved that phone. It's in the closet. I said one day, you know, it'll be a conversation piece.
Oh, man, that is too funny. That was the voice of my longtime friend, Nick Giles, telling one of his amazing stories. He is my guest today, and you will hear more stories. I also want to announce and clear the air that Nick is not dead. In fact, as you can tell by listening to him, he's very much alive. Although a Goddard has not been in the funeral business in Taylor County for almost 25 years, there's something about a picture posted with a brief write-up with the Goddard name attached to it that some people will think it is an obituary. When one person thinks that and passes on the news, word gets around pretty quickly in a small town. In this case, I did post a picture and a write-up about Nick, but that was just an attempt to promote this particular episode of the podcast. It was not to announce his passing. So if you have taken tater salad or fried chicken to the house, you can certainly go get it and eat it yourself. That is, if Nick hasn't already eaten it. This is Bruce Goddard, by the way, and you're listening to the View from a Hearse podcast. My previous comment about the obituary was an addition that Nick was not privy to when we recorded this. But as always, thank you for listening. Nick Giles is a former longtime sheriff of Taylor County, Georgia. I believe you will discover that being a sheriff in a small rural county is different than you think it is. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that many of us have no idea about. Nick is a great guy. His reputation as a sheriff and as a human being is as good as it gets. And trust me, I would know that. He was raised by great parents who set him on the right path, and he and his wife Kay have a wonderful family of their own that he'll tell you about. Nick has met an awful lot of people along the way in his role as sheriff and in other roles. With that comes lots of stories, as you might imagine. So before we get into all this, Nick, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Okay, great. After that kind of an introduction, Bruce, I think we ought to call it quits right now. That was great, and thank you very much.
You're well thought of, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, let me start off and just tell you a little quick bit about my family. I met my wife, Kay, 40 plus years ago. She was a young school teacher in Taylor County, and I squired her around a little bit, and we courted there for a couple of years. Got married. Matter of fact, we celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary this March. Wow. We've been blessed with two great kids. Our son, Lee, he's now 38. He and his wife, Lindsay, live at St. Simon's Island, and they have three children. The first, Thomas Edwin Giles, named after my dad. We call him Tomcat. He's 6 years old. William Hardy Giles, we call him Woody. He's 3 years old, and he's named after two of my grandfathers. And the youngest, 6 months, born back in October, James Terrell Giles, also known as JT. JT is named after Lindsay's father, Terry. Lee is the golf sales manager for Sea Island Resorts. And Lindsay works for the hospital, the Southeast Georgia Health System there at the Glenn County Brunswick Hospital. Not only is she beautiful, not only is she a good wife and a good mother, she is a financial analyst for a multi-specialty physician practice within the Southeast Georgia Health System. Last January, Lindsay stopped what she was doing to set up and manage the COVID vaccine clinic at the hospital. And last August, she set up and managed the Delta variant testing clinic there. While doing all of that, she was pregnant. She would get up and leave home at 6 in the morning, not return until sometime at night. Lee would have to look after the kids for that part, but she volunteered to do that. She just felt like it was something she needed to do. She right now currently oversees all the prior authorization department and electronic health record training team. And I just can't tell you how proud I am of Lindsay, all she's accomplished. Our daughter, Lauren, is now 34. She and her husband, Ben, live in Bozeman, Montana, and they have two great kids. Benjamin Wynn is 7 years old, and Catherine Lee is 4. Kaylee, I call her KL, and there's a reason for that. Mr. Kenneth Lee Barrow was one of my best friends ever.
Oh, he was mine too, man.
Man, I worked for him as a kid loading watermelons, and up until right until his death, Mr. Kenneth and I ate breakfast together every morning at 5 o'clock. And I told him when Catherine Lee, her name, Kaylee, her first name, Catherine, is obviously for my mother, and the K on it is for Kay, and then the Lee is for our son Lee, and I call her KL. And I'd always tell Mr. Kenneth that they named her after him, and we had a big to do about that. He really liked it, got a big charge out of it. But
he was a character for sure.
Oh, he really was. But they live in Bozeman. Ben's a dentist there. Lauren majored in early childhood education, and she hopes to return to teaching as soon as Kaylee starts school.
Right. Well, one thing that I've noticed about you, like all of us, when you start getting our age, you spending a heck of a lot of time with your kids. I see you out in Montana, and see you at the island down there.
I tell you, we don't get to go to Montana a lot. We go, 2 or 3 times, and they come here a couple of times. Thank goodness for FaceTime.
Your children are a product of y'all, and it's incredible the quality of people come from places that are small and rural like you and I grew up in. It's pretty heck of a story. So, Nick, you obviously have a wonderful family, and I see you enjoying the heck out of them, and they and I know they love y'all, man. I can see it. And
I do.
It ain't nothing more important than that. If we didn't talk about anything else, just talk about that, that's enough. I can tell you that. But
that's right. My mother, Catherine Payne Giles, she worked until she was 90 years old. She was a bookkeeper at the Ford Place in Butler. She was a bookkeeper at Payne's Warehouse in Cotton Gin, and she also kept books for my dad at the Standard Oil Distributorship. She lived to be 97, and during World War II, she rebuilt generators and starters for Fort Benning for the military, and her claim to fame was she sat at the table one night with Mr. Henry Ford and his wife, Ms. Ford. They were at a dealership meeting sponsored by Beaudry Ford in Atlanta. And early on, Ms. Ford realized that there were only going to be 3 ladies in attendance, she and Ms. Beaudry and my mom. So Ms. Ford prearranged where they could all sit at the same table. A week or 2 later, she got a Western Union telegram from Ms. Ford telling her how much she enjoyed it. She loved that. My dad, Thomas Edwin Giles, everybody in the county knew him as Tomcat.
Yep.
And he was full of life. He loved everything. He was my hero, and he's still my hero today. Daddy served 18 months in combat in the South Pacific during World War II. He was a Marine gunner, a master sergeant. He flew on a TBM Avenger. That was a torpedo bomber. And he was a gunner. He participated in 3 major campaigns, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Georgia. His unit received a presidential citation for gallantry for their bombing of Rabaul. He served also, his commanding officer was Colonel Joseph Foss, who later became a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Daddy was a heck of a baseball player, played baseball with a semi-pro team in Tampa, Florida called the Tampa Smokers. They were based out of Ebro City. Daddy used to tell a story about his catcher's mitt. Those catcher's mitts back in those days were made out of nothing. the catchers were always getting bones broken in the hands and bruised up real bad. Daddy was working at a place, Kingman Packing Company, a meat packing company, and he would cut him a big piece of beef, wrap it in a loincloth, and slide it down in his mitt. And it did the trick. There's no injuries. It absorbed everything. But what was the cool part about it was after about 15 or 20 pitches, the blood from that raw meat started running down his arm. And the opposing team thought, man, this guy is one tough cat out here, and they feared him. But I grew up all my life, Bruce, as you know, in Taylor County. I grew
up. You
up
come from good stock, brother. You come from good stock. Yeah,
I really did. I grew up as a single child. I had an older brother that died when I was before I was born. He died at birth. I had two first cousins, still got them, Nana Gerald and Willie Payne.
Yep.
Everybody's close as a brother and a sister as you could have. We grew up within walking distance of one another. We ate at my grandmother's house every Sunday for lunch and dinner. Willie and I did all the things young boys do growing up. We worked on the farms for Uncle Hubert and Uncle W.S. We loaded watermelons. We had a little roving band of boys in town. One week we were loading watermelons for H.A. Locke. The next week we were loading for Mr. Rand Cooper or Mr. Kenneth Barrow or Uncle W.S. or some of them. We went all over during the summer, but I guess the hardest job I ever had in my life was pulling cuckaburrs in a peanut field. That was awful. Mr. Buren Joyner had to come catch me up every morning, because I'd lag behind from all the other fellows. But back in those days, Bruce, I remember fertilizer, we referred to it as guiana. And ammonium nitrate was soda or top dressing. We worked hard, but we enjoyed it. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have iPads or things like that. And I never picked any cotton, but I ginned some. Uncle W.S. had a cotton gin, and Willie and I worked in that cotton gin every year. But I did have some friends that picked cotton. I know you remember Jake Woodall.
Yep.
He married Mr. Howard Hennon's daughter,
That's right.
Luana.
They live in Texas, yep.
Yeah. I remember Jake Woodall and all of his brothers picking cotton as kids, and they picked for 1 cent a pound, and they were glad to get it. Willie and I picked butter beans and peas for 2 and 3 cents a pound, and we thought we were doing something. Mom used to buy our clothes at Mr. Thomas Mathis's, a clothing store there at Butler. And I remember she always bought our blue jeans 2 or 3 inches too long, and we folded them up. She said we could grow into them, but heck, till the 3rd or 4th grade, we never wore shoes to school. Our attire was blue jeans, a white T-shirt, and that was it. So we had a good time.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got in all this law enforcement career? How did that start?
After graduating high school in '73, I went to Americus to the trade school. I was going to take up automotive maintenance and mechanical work and all that. I was really into cars back in those days. And I am probably one of the few people that have ever flunked the technical school. But after the first semester, I had flunked so badly. Of course, all I was doing was partying. I had a party crowd, and it was out all night long. And I remember after the first semester, my dad told me that he thought it would be good for me to let some other student use my desk, maybe the next semester, and maybe for me to come home and get a job. Well, heck, that was music to my ears. I wanted to get a job. I wanted to make money. The only thing on my mind was girls and fast cars. So I come home and I worked at the Ford place for Uncle Hubert. I worked at the sand pit in Junction City. I did a variety of jobs. But along about 1974, the EMT business started up in Taylor County. I know you remember it well. Mac, your brother, Mac Goddard, ran the ambulance service and rentals. Of course, you probably ran it as much as Mac did, but he was the director.
I became an EMT in 1974 too.
Okay.
Yep.
We were right about that same time.
Yep.
And Ed Robinson ran the show in Butler. And Ed Robinson was kind enough to let me do some part-time EMT work once I had graduated. And I worked part-time with Taylor County for a while. That's where I got the bug at. It really set me on fire. So I applied and got a job in Peach County that year. And at that time, the ambulance service in Peach County was being operated out of the sheriff's office. Later, it moved over to the hospital. But when I started, it was run out of the sheriff's office. And Sheriff Reg Mullis was in charge. Well, I loved it. I was doing what I wanted to do, but I also got close to a lot of people over there. I met a lot of people: Jimmy Yancey, Jimmy Jones, James Barber, a lot of those guys. And I got the law enforcement bug right there. That's where it all started. So I come back to Taylor County, and I go down and I see Sheriff Charles Wright. And I begged him, Sheriff, I really want to be a deputy sheriff. Would you hire me? Well, he did. He hired me in 1975. I worked for Sheriff Wright for 9 years. The first year, Sheriff Wright put me in the jail and on the radio. And he said, you're going to have to work here for at least a year before I put you out on the road. Best thing he ever did for me, because when you're out on the road, you don't have an opportunity to judge people very much, size them up, and determine what's going to happen next. When that person is locked up in that jail, he can raise all amount of cane he wants to in there. He can't hurt you. He's locked up. It gives you an opportunity to see how people react in different situations. So, and of course, I've been a big advocate of that. Every deputy I ever hired had to work in the jail at least a year before I put him out on the road. And I see a lot of deputies nowadays, and I see a lot of police officers that go to mandate school, they get certified, and they're thrown out on the streets right by themselves. And that is asking for trouble. Finally, I got to go to mandate school. After 6 weeks, he put me on the road. But for so many nights, it was just like a year or two, I probably rode with Chief Deputy Paul Robinson every night. And I learned so much from him, Sheriff Wright. There was no school that could compare to what I learned from those two men. They really taught me a lot. And it's not only those people. Butler Police Chief Carol Peacock, Reynolds Police Chief L.D. Gordon. I can't begin to tell you what those men meant to me and what I learned from them. Not so much about law enforcement, but about how to treat people and things like that. And that's where it all started. I had some other good buddies in those early days too. We all remember Donnie Peacock from Ficklin Mill, Georgia. Donnie was a
state patrolman.
Yep.
Yep.
Yes, sir. And he would patrol Taylor County. I'd ride with him a lot of nights. Captain Jack Barker. Oh man, he's a legend. And I've eaten with Donnie and Jack both in Thomaston. We'll meet up there and have breakfast. And Reuben Hoyle, Harville Estes. I learned a lot from those people, and they were good to me. Our communication equipment and our radios back in those days was little to nothing. We were lucky if we could reach GSP Manchester at night. And I worked the night shift for several years. I'd come on at 11 o'clock and work till 7 the next morning. And many nights after midnight, I was out there by myself. Of course, crime then was not what crime is today. But you still, you had to be careful. You had to watch what you were doing. Things could escalate very quickly. You could get a drunk on the side of the road that didn't want to cooperate and it didn't want to go with you.
I don't know how you do it. I can tell. Even then, I don't know how you did it. But that's a tough job.
Yeah, back then we didn't have tasers.
Right.
And you couldn't just shoot the guy and kill him on the side of the road. But so you had to improvise. We had deputies back then that could fight. I was not one of them. I was usually pretty good with my mouth.
You had to use a lot of psychology, and those guys that you just talked about were masters at it, right?
They were. We did all kind of things as deputies back in those days. We worked a lot of moonshine, a lot of liquor steals, worked a ton of marijuana. Let me tell you, I have sit on so many marijuana fields, I couldn't count them all. And I have my buddies all the time tell me, these big deer hunting deals, they'll tell me these stories. I say, man, I'm sitting in my deer stand and that big buck walks out and your chest just gets to beating and banging, And I tell them, I say, let me tell you something. You need to be sitting down on a creek bank at 2 o'clock in the morning, no lights, no cigarettes. You're scared to death an old water moccasin's going to crawl up your pants leg. You don't know what to do. You're sitting there, and all of a sudden, you hear a car door shut just up the hill. You talking about your heart start beating, and a minute later, you see that flashlight coming down the trail. Within minutes, it's time to announce yourself. And of course, the guy is going to take what we call the bush bond. He's gone, and a lot of deputies would try to chase it. You're never going to catch him. He is more afraid. He's scared than any time he's ever been in his life. So the thing to do is you go to the car. Instead of chasing him, you run to his car, and then you got him from there. That was a chase. Let me tell you, an automobile chase. Back in those days, Bruce, we craved a car chase. And back in those days, cars were fast. We had these road runners and Mustangs and things, and everybody had a fast car. And on a Friday or Saturday night, there was a good chance somebody was going to get in a chase with you. And we loved it. I think my first patrol car was a 73 LTD. And Mr. Jamie Cox had built a Boss 429 Cobra jet engine and put in it, and it would fly. It wrapped the speedometer completely around the dial, And I was a pretty good driver back then. I'd driven some old race cars, and I was fearless. Nothing in an automobile. I could do it all. And we just loved a good chase. And nowadays they've got these spike strips that they roll out across the road. Right. Back then we said we had the chrome horn. And we'd put the bumper to the back end of them, spin them out and things like that. But,
unbelievable. Were you trained to do that, or you just knew how to do it?
Well, I picked it up from other guys. I'd see another deputy do it and then mimic what he had done, that sort of thing.
So after doing all that, and you were deputy for all these years for Charlie Wright, and I know that Sheriff Wright had a great influence on you.
Oh, he did. He was, Sheriff Wright had a way about doing things. It was his way or the highway. You understood that right off the bat. I've never heard anybody speak bad of him. He was good to the people of Taylor County. He looked after folks.
When you decided, I'm going to run for sheriff, did you have somebody running against you?
Oh, yes, I had. I can't remember. It was 6 or 7 people ran against me. This was in 1983. Sheriff Wright, as you know, was killed in a very tragic automobile accident.
Right.
And right after that, I had people come to me and ask me to run. And I talked it over with Kay and decided we'd do it. But we had a runoff after the first election, and the runoff was between myself and Judson Montgomery. Judson is a dear friend of mine, has been for a long time. And I think if we ever had a clean election, I think his and mine was. I didn't, badmouth him. He didn't badmouth me. It was funny. Judson and I went to mandate school at the same time. We rode together. He was working with the Reynolds Police Department, started in law enforcement about the same time I did. So we had ridden together back and forth to Columbus for 6 weeks. And, if you don't know a guy in 6 weeks of riding 2 hours a day with him, you're not going to. Judd and I, we're still great friends, and I see him all along around town somewhere we speak.
So let me ask you this. So all of a sudden, you were elected sheriff, and you go in you're in charge. What was your thoughts? All of a sudden, you're the sheriff of the county.
Well, it was good and it was bad.
I can only imagine.
It was not what I thought it was going to be, because I'm thinking, I got elected, everybody's going to like me. There was still a lot of people resented the fact that I'm only 27 years old. And you can imagine a guy 50 or 60 years old, he doesn't appreciate a young guy like me out there telling him what to do or how to do it. So getting over that hurdle took a couple of years to, I had to prove myself. I had to do some things and show the public that I was going to be a man of my word, that I'd get out there and work for them and work hard and things like that. But I always surrounded myself with good employees. And if you surround yourself with good folks, that sure does lighten the load on you. and I had good deputies. I had Mac Perry. That was another thing. I appointed an African American as my first chief deputy. He had the seniority in the office. He had been there longer than anybody, and it was only right. And I felt I was doing the right thing. But I had him. I had Lorraine McCants. I had Jim Wainwright, Oscar Carpenter. I tell you, one person I'll mention, of course, he's like a legend in law enforcement in Middle Georgia, and that was Mr. Wanza Davis.
Right.
Mr. Wanza was one of my deputies. He was probably in his 60s when I got elected sheriff. I had just turned 27 when the August primary developed, and that's when I won the runoff after the primary. I've always felt a little uncomfortable trying to tell Mr. Wanza what to do when he had 10 times more experience than I did, and age-wise and all. But let me tell you, Wanza Davis could not have been, he was the best political machine that I had. And I tell you what I mean. Say, for instance, we had a man died in the community and left a widow. 2 weeks later, Mr. Wanza goes out to her house. I know absolutely nothing about this. I don't know what's going on, but he would make a habit of going to that lady's home, knock on her door. When she came to the door, he would remove his hat, place it somewhere in the vicinity of his heart, and she'd say, "Mr. Davis, can I help you?" And his remark would be, "Ma'am, Sheriff Giles sent me out here to check on you. Is there anything we can do for you, or do you need anything?" I wouldn't know a thing about it. A week later, I might get a little thank you card in the mail, or I might see the lady, at the grocery store, the post office, or something, and they'd thank me. That happened more times than I can remember. Wanza he was a caring person, and he wanted to help people.
Right.
Now, let me tell you, don't cross him.
Right.
Don't raise your hand to him, because you're not going to like the results of what's about to happen. Wanza's thought was that if you stuck your finger in the light socket, you got punished immediately. And like I said, we didn't have tasers, we didn't have stun guns and those things. And buddy, when you crossed up with Mr. Wanza, he was a man's man.
Yep.
When Wanza Davis walked in the room, he commanded respect, and he got it. And I just can't say enough about Wanza Davis. He was.
How long did you serve as sheriff, Nick?
15 years, and I forget how many months, 6 months or something like that. Not quite 16 years. I had served as president of the Sheriff's Association in 92 and 93. And I had an offer to go to work with them as a lobbyist and do special events work for Georgia Sheriff Youth Homes. My salary would absolutely double.
Right.
It was a no-brainer. I loved Bruce. Let me tell you, when I got elected sheriff, my salary was $18,000 a year.
Isn't that amazing?
I worked 70 and 80 hours a week. You couldn't make it. I had 2 kids. I needed to think about college and things like that. Going to work with the Sheriff's Association would have doubled my salary. A lot less work, a lot less stress. So I took it. When I got to Atlanta with the Sheriff's Association, was in Stockbridge, and I worked in Stockbridge, but I lobbied some down at the Capitol, and I got down there and staying at the old Stadium Hotel over there on Capitol Avenue was not at all what I thought it was going to be. I met a lawyer from Columbus, Georgia named Jim Butler, and that's who I work for now. I've been with Jim 21 years now, and I'm the senior investigator here. We've got offices in Columbus, Atlanta, and Savannah.
Wow.
And we don't do any criminal work. It's a lot of product liability, plaintiff type work.
You've had some bizarre cases that you've had to deal with being sheriff. People have no idea what a sheriff has to deal with, and I think they would love to hear some of that.
Probably the craziest thing ever happened to me. I was approached in I think it was like early April, maybe it was 84. I had been sheriff even a year. And there was a guy, I won't mention his name because he has relatives in our county and they're good people. But this guy was, I knew that he was involved in drug smuggling. He was a great pilot. He was a daredevil. lived by the seat of his pants. He was down in New Orleans, Baton Rouge area. He was flying workers out to the oil derricks and back on a helicopter. I had enough intelligence and had talked to other law enforcement calling me, wanting to check on him and, things like that. I knew what was going on, but like I said, he hadn't been caught at that time. Well, the guy calls me and says, I'm coming to Butler tomorrow and I'd like to come talk to you a minute. I said, sure, come on. He comes to see me and he's got a pistol strapped on. I thought that was a little unusual. He tells me he is working for the federal government. Well, I knew that was a lie. There's no way the federal government would have hired this guy. But he tells me that he wants me to meet a guy, his supervisor. He wants me to meet him and wants to talk to me about a special mission that's going on in the government. No, I said, sure, I whatever. So he tells me we're going to come to Butler next week on such and such a day and would like to meet with you. I said, all right. The day before then, he calls me and says, we'll be at the airport in Butler at 12 noon. Sure enough, the next day, this big Mitsubishi aircraft lands, twin engine, nicest plane I'd seen in Butler ever. Lands and this guy gets out. He and the man I had talked with get out. And he introduces himself to me as Barry Seal. I'd never heard of Barry Seal. No idea who this guy was. He was a chubby guy. He tells me that they both work for the government, that they have a supervisor in the National Security Council, and what they are doing is they are moving weapons to Nicaragua to support the Contra rebels against the Sandinista outlaws. I'm like, this is too far fetched, and they wanted to bring guns from Columbus, from Fort Benning, to my shop building, which sat on the airport. There was no fence around the Butler airport back in those days. It was totally open. They wanted to put a pickup truck with these guns in my shop building. Then a plane would land. The guns would be carried and offloaded onto this aircraft, and they'd leave. And that's all I had to do. I still declined because I knew the guy that first contacted me. And he can't work for the federal government. This has got to be more than what they're telling me. And I'm the whole time I'm thinking drug smuggling. So I declined. A day or two later, they asked me if I would meet with their supervisor in Atlanta, who was with, I think, like the National Security Council, whatever. And I said, okay, I'll do it. I still had a little doubt in my mind. Mm-hmm. I go to Peachtree DeKalb Airport up in DeKalb County, and I meet this guy. He gets a plane lands. I didn't see the plane land, but when the man walked into the FBO, he sticks his hand out and introduces himself. We didn't have, internet. None of this had made the newspapers at that time. This is early 1984. And again, I declined him because he wasn't in uniform. He had no business card. He had no nothing. Well, I politely declined, told him I just wasn't interested. And he thanked me and he left. I ran over to the window and wrote the N number down on the plane he was in. And on the way home, when I got back to Butler, I called the DEA in Atlanta because I thought they were trying to recruit me for some, clandestine drug operation. So I call the DEA. I tell them that this guy, he said he was a lieutenant colonel, and this guy, Barry Seal, says he's working for the government. And the guy I knew previously, and gave him all this information and never heard another word back. It was just over. And a year or so later, it's all over the news. And here's a picture of broadcast all over the world. And I'm like, that's him. I met this guy. And then there's pictures of Barry Seal. He was probably the most notable drug smuggler of all time. As a matter of fact, I think last year or something, Tom Cruise did a movie portraying Barry Seal. The movie was called American Made. And, it's just crazy. And then, within a year, by 1986, had been charged with 3 or 4 felonies. He'd been stripped of rank. He's, no longer a soldier. Barry Seal gets assassinated at a Salvation Army depot in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, by a cartel hit squad. Barry Seal was so wanted by the Medellin cartel in South America. The cartel leader, Pablo Escobar, put a $1 million bounty on Seal's head for anybody that could kill him. He also put a $5 million bounty on him for anybody that could bring him to him alive. And they wound up killing him. And my buddy wound up dying upstate, I think, Ohio, in a federal penitentiary. They all got caught.
And they were trying to suck you in with them, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I read about the Iran-Contra affair. I think, I could have been a part of that.
You sure could have.
But thank goodness I wasn't. I guess another bizarre story was one that you and I were involved in. I was called one night in the middle of the night out to a hunting camp.
I remember that one.
I get out there in this hunting camp. Is it appropriate to tell this, Bruce? Do you want me to tell it?
Probably not, but it's okay. We don't know who they are. I wouldn't know them if they stood on the hood of my car.
Well, I get out there and I met at this hunting camp. It's a cabin, and I'm met by this lady. She's very distraught. The call came in. Our dispatcher told me that there was a deceased person in this hunting camp. So I get out there, and when they told me a deceased person, I told them, we'll call Bruce, get him to come on, and you were the coroner at the time. And I get out there, and the lady meets me at the door, and she says, he's back here in the bed. I go back there, and the first thing hits me is the man. He's deceased, all right. There's no doubt about that. He had some discoloring and things like that. I could look at him, tell he was dead. But what threw me off course was the clothing that he had on. He was dressed in women's clothing for a good bit. And I'm like, well, I know things get kinky and people do some crazy things, So at that point, she says, I need to talk to, if you're the person in charge, I need to talk to you in private. And I said, yes, ma'am. What is it? She says, he's not my husband. I said, okay. I've dealt with a few things similar to this. I said, it's no big deal. I said, I'll try to keep it sort of secret if I can. If he's your boyfriend and you want to, you don't want people to know about it. She said, no, sir, you don't understand. He's my first cousin. I said, oh, Lord. I said, all right, well, I think at that time I went out and conferred with Bruce about what should we do. Anybody that you can call that can help with this situation. And she did. She had somebody in the family she could call, and that person said, let me come down there and I'll take care of it. And, we're sitting there dealing with this thing. And I mean, we can't hurt the guy any more than he's already hurt. He's dead. And all we can do at this point is hurt a family. This man had children. He had a wife. And, so we just sort of let it go and let the relative come down and take care of it. That was probably one of the strangest deals.
Y'all called me and I got there and you said, we need to talk about this. And,
Yeah.
and then you told me the situation. And I remember going in, he actually died in the act of sex, if I remember right. Isn't that what they said?
That could be. It's been a long time.
Yeah, but I saw these they had a lot of VHS movies, and I figured they were looking at porno movies. And I went over to look at it was Western movies they were looking at. That was a bizarre thing, but you did the right thing. We both said that we're not going to lie. If somebody asks us, we'll tell the truth. But if they don't, we just going to say that he died of a heart attack, which he did.
It was with no need to hurt any people further.
You also had relationships with these judges, and I know one of them was Judge Lynn. He was around a long time. Tell us about him and your relationship. I know you got some stories with. He's a Superior Court judge, and of course the sheriff is obviously friends with all these judges that come, the circuit judges that come in the county. So
that's right.
I know you got some stories there.
Yeah, Judge Land, John Henry Land was a dear friend. He helped me a lot. And I didn't realize it to begin with, but with the first term of court we had, he tells me, he says, I want you to open court. You open both doors, you swing them out wide, you announce, hear ye, hear ye. This session of Taylor County Superior Court is now in session. You give the date, and then you say, the Honorable John Henry Land presiding. He said, I'll make my entrance into the courtroom, and I want you to sit right beside me. I said, yes, sir. So I got a chair and put it up there right beside the judge's bench where I could be beside him. And what he would do, we would have arraignment day. That's where all the defendants can come in and they have the opportunity of pleading guilty or innocent. And a lot of them would come in and want to plead, guilty and get the case over with. Judge Land, on many occasions, would turn around and look at me and say, Mr. Sheriff, what do you think I ought to do with him? And, of course, the guy being a Taylor County constituent, if he hadn't committed a terrible act, and I thought he was somebody we could maybe rehabilitate, I would say, well, Your Honor, he works every day, and I think if you put him on sheriff's probation, I'll look after him. Then Judge Land would turn around and say, Mr. So-and-so, the sheriff has just saved you a term in the state penitentiary. You ought to thank him when court's over. And said, that's what I'll do, Sheriff. I'm going to put him on sheriff's probation. There was no such thing as sheriff's probation other than just it was a term.
Right.
But we did that numerous times. One morning we were sitting in the judge's chambers and Mr. Garland Bird come in. It's right after arraignment. And, of course, he and Judge Land were best friends.
So people don't know, he was a well-known attorney that was at one time the lieutenant governor of Georgia.
Right. Mr. Garland was a Taylor County resident, a great lawyer and great friend. But anyway, Mr. Garland comes in and says, Judge, you got to quit doing this. And Judge Land says, I got to quit doing what, Garland? He said, you got to quit letting the sheriff handle all these cases. He's costing us money. He said, me and Alec Davis not making a dime with him in here. And he said, on Monday mornings before arraignment, said, I look out my window and there's 20 or 30 people lined up over at the sheriff's office getting free legal advice. And he's literally representing them in court. You got to stop it. And Judge Land started laughing and he said, well, Garland, I do see your point. But all of my judges, I had Judge Mullins Wisnant. He was great. Judge Wisnant did the swearing in ceremony for me when I was elected president of the Georgia Sheriff's Association, simply because he was the chief judge at the time. But I had Judge Bill Smith, Judge Doug Pullen, just some great guys, and they really, really helped me out. They looked after me, and I was a young sheriff and I needed somebody to keep me steered in the right direction.
You had a story about K. Ronnie Wainwright that I heard you tell one time. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we were at a fish fry one night. Judge Land and I had gone out somewhere to a cabin or something, this fish fry, and we're out there, and K. Ronnie is there. And for the people that don't know K. Ronnie, he was like a legend in Taylor County.
He was one of a kind.
He was one of a kind. Always had a joke or a story or something. And we're out there, and K. Ronnie's had a drink or two, and he walks up to Judge Land, and out of the blue says, Judge, you got any pictures of your wife in the nude? And Judge Land is just sort of stopped in his tracks. And he says, no, Corona, I don't. Out in the country, we all called him K. Ronnie. People from the city called him Corona.
Because that's how he spelled his name, Corona.
Yeah, that's right. Judge Land is shell-shocked, and he says, no, Corona, I don't. And all of a sudden, K. Ronnie opens up his shirt pocket and reaches in as if to get some. And he says, how would you like to buy some? And I tell you what, I just about fainted right there. And I told him, I said, K. Ronnie, you got to go. You're going to get us all locked up here tonight. But Judge Land had a big laugh about it. He thought it was funny. And for some reason after that, every time we had a fish fry, a deer supper or something, Judge Land expected K. Ronnie to be there. And sometimes he had some good jokes, and sometimes he told us some that would make you cringe.
Yeah, when he came in my funeral home, I would look around when he's supposed to tell me a story to see who's standing by. One time, Nick, he it was some of his relatives, but he was comforting his mama and maybe his aunt. And he was I was driving the family. We were pulling off from the funeral home, following the hearse, and they were both crying. Kay Roney had his arms around both of them. It was a very emotional moment. And all of a sudden, Kay Roney said, "Bruce, you know how many people it takes to eat a possum?" And I said, "What?" I thought, "How many?" What am I supposed to say? He said, 3. You got to have 2 to watch the traffic. What was your greatest achievement as a sheriff?
Wow. Bill Smith was a district attorney. William J. Smith was our district attorney. And he had been an FBI agent prior to becoming a lawyer. And he talked to me about the FBI Academy and told me that I could get in the FBI Academy with an invitation, and that it was a very prestigious school for law enforcement, and he wanted me to do it. So I do. He helps me do all the paperwork, the application, and everything. He and I walk over to Garland Bird's office, Mr. Garland, the lawyer, and we go over there and tell him what we're up to. Mr. Garland says, "Let me call Sam Nunn right quick." And sitting there in his office, he calls Senator Sam Nunn and asks him, says, "Sam," and they're like best friends. They're talking one-on-one. He says, "Sam, I want to get my sheriff in the FBI Academy. What do we need to do?" Sam Nunn says, "Let me call Judge William Webster." He was the director of the FBI at the time. See what we can do. 3 or 4 weeks later, I went to Atlanta and took the polygraph test, the drug test, did the background test and all that. And a month or 2 later, I got a written invitation from Judge William Webster to come to the FBI. Well, I started in March the 29th of 1987, and I graduated on June the 7th. And I was in the 149th session at the U.S. Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. And one of the highlights of that was my dad was able to come to my graduation.
Wow.
One of the U.S. Marine Corps bands played at our graduation.
And he was a Marine, yeah.
Yeah, what was cool, I was invited to attend the academy by Judge William Webster. By the time I graduated, Judge William Sessions was the director. So I was invited under Webster and graduated under Sessions.
So here's this young guy that started being an EMT and hanging around the local sheriff's department
and pulled kookaburras in peanut field.
Yeah.
Is now walking down the stage at the FBI Academy.
Unbelievable.
And let me tell you something else. You'll get a charge out of this. Downs Scott came with Daddy. So Downs and my dad were there. That was a big deal.
Dealer Downs, yep.
Yep. The second big deal for me was when I got elected as president of the Georgia Sheriff's Association. And that's of the 159 sheriffs in Georgia. They chose to have me as their leader for 92 and 93. Bell South sponsored the occasion and the banquet. It was held at the Cobb Galleria in Marietta. And by that time, my dad was deceased, but my mom got to be there, and she got to be present. So that was my 2 real big deals.
Well, it's right amazing. It's amazing. So
yeah, it was.
So let me ask you this: did you have any disappointments in being the sheriff?
Sure, I did. I guess the biggest disappointment, Bruce, was the murder of our school teacher, our beloved school teacher, Tommy Purvis. Tommy was a dear friend of mine. He was a friend of my family. When I built my house, Tommy helped Mr. Neil Hennon during the summer months when he was out of school building my house. We attended some car races together, and we were good friends. And he was murdered in his own home one night. We never did solve the case, and that weighs on my shoulders. I take full responsibility for it. We did a lot. We had the GBI there within hours. We had the crime lab there within hours from Atlanta. I took the case to the behavioral sciences unit at Quantico when I was up there and had them analyze it and research it. We went to a grand jury a couple of times. Unfortunately, the stars didn't line up, and the district attorney didn't think we had enough to indict someone. I did, but I wasn't in charge of that part of it. It's still an open case. I think there's not many days of the week that go by that I don't think about that case.
So Nick, that's what people don't realize, the passion somebody like you has for that. And here you hadn't been a sheriff for whatever it's been, 24 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And you still think about a case that didn't get solved. I
still think about it. He's got one of them. I hadn't talked with his mother in a long time now, but she's one of the most precious ladies you ever met. And let me tell you something hard to do. It's hard to answer the phone or have her walk in your office and, 6 months has passed. 6 years has passed.
Yep.
And you still hadn't solved the crime. And one day she loves you, the next day she hates you. And you can't blame her. You can't blame her one bit. So that was, I won't really go into all of this.
Right.
It's still an open case. And I actually addressed this somewhat a year or so ago on Facebook and tried to explain what occurred, what we did, and what investigative techniques we used. But, again, like I said all the time, I was the sheriff at the time. I was the head law enforcement guy in the county, and it's on my shoulders. Wow. And I pray one day it'll be solved. We had another case, Bruce, and I won't mention names here because they're relatives, but we had an elderly lady in town or in the county that was assaulted soon after I was elected sheriff. We never solved that. There were no witnesses or anything like that. I actually talked to Sheriff Watson and his investigator, Wallace Carpenter, not long ago. There are so many new techniques for DNA testing and automated fingerprint, the automated, all the tests that are out there today. And there is a new test on DNA that can really do some great things. It solved a lot of cases. I always felt like the suspect left Taylor County and went to another state. I talked to the sheriff last year about this, and I talked to him again recently about it. He has met with the GBI, and we're very hopeful that they're going to go to another state and maybe conduct a search warrant and get a DNA sample from this suspect. And I'm still very hopeful that that case could be solved. I don't know, but there's still a lot of hope out there for me that I think we can solve it. It's just going to take a little legwork.
Didn't you have a friendship with President Carter?
I did, yeah. Back in those days when he was president and I was sheriff, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have iPads and laptops and all that sort of stuff. I had a good friend that was on his Secret Service detail, a guy, Stan Burris from Albany. Stan would call me on the hot phone, which was not a secure phone, but it was something the White House had provided. But they would come from planes going to Marietta to Dobbins Air Force Base, or either to Warner Robins. And back then, where Smith's Pharmacy is located now, Bobby Bazemore's drugstore, started life as a Hardee's restaurant. And Hardee's was sort of a new chain that had come out. And President Carter loved a Hardee's breakfast. So Stan Burris would call me and say, Sheriff, we're about 5 miles out of Butler. We're going to stop at Hardee's and get a biscuit. President Carter wants to know if you want to join him. And of course, naturally I would. I'd take off up there and we'd have breakfast. He'd have the First Lady, Ms. Carter, with him, and we would eat. Well, then we get through eating. He'd say, Sheriff, I need a landline phone. Can we go down to the office? Certainly. So we'd go down to the sheriff's office and I'd let him, he'd use my desk and my phone, and Ms. Carter, I'd ask her, do you need to go to the restroom or anything? She'd say, I think I do, before we start back. And I had a little private restroom there in my office, and she'd go in there and I'd step outside. I didn't want to listen to whatever was being said,
Oh, I thought you meant you would step outside the restroom while she was using it.
No, yeah, I did that too. But
you got a president of the United States eating at Hardee's in Butler and coming to your office and sitting at your desk.
Can you believe it?
That is crazy. Unbelievable. Did you have to clear the building out or anything? Did they check?
No, but I would, I'd call down there on the radio and I'd tell them to let one of the trustees run through my office and, get the trash out, and, make sure everything's presentable.
That is unbelievable.
But it's just a great, he had talked to me about the shoal bass on the Flint River. And he later one year he came back up there and went fishing with us. This was after he had retired. But
that's unbelievable that the sitting president of the United States can use your desk and miss the first lady going in to use your restroom.
Bruce, we'd have 3 black Suburbans parked out front. I mean, it was crazy. But he was a nice guy.
The best part of that story was that she used your restroom and you said you would step out. I'm glad you stepped out while she was doing that. You obviously have had a wonderful career. You're still going strong. You certainly hadn't quit. What advice do you have for your grandchildren? If you could tell them what they need to know about life, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them to work hard, train hard. Your hardest times often lead to your greatest moments.
That is true.
That'd be it, I think.
That is true. Well, you've done a heck of a job. You and Kay both have done a wonderful job raising your kids. It's funny. These little towns produce some pretty strong people, and you and Kay are both examples of that in your family. I'm proud to know you. What advice do you have for the next sheriff for Taylor County?
Well, I tell him the first 1 week they're going to love you, and the next week they're going to hate you, but not to worry, you're going to get paid for both weeks.
I love it, man. Nick, you're a treasure. I got to tell you, I'm sure you've probably made some people mad along the way. You can't be sheriff and not upset apple cart a little bit, but
let me tell you the answer to that right quick. My mama told me when I got into politics, she told me you're going to find out that some people are still mad because Christmas comes on the 25th of December and there's nothing you can do about it.
That's true.
And that's right. That's
true. But the reality is you went through that. You have a great reputation. You did a lot of things right. And these stories could go on, and we need to do it again because I know you've got so many stories.
Oh, yeah.
You've had a great life. You've had a great run, and I really appreciate you joining. I just think people would like to hear from behind the scenes look at a local sheriff. This has been good.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for having me, and I hope your listeners have enjoyed it. And I would definitely like to come back and do it again.
All right, man. Nick, thank you so much.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.